Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for week one of the Crime Stoppers Gulf Wellington series with Cal Millar. This series is part of our Crime Stoppers Awareness Month, and we are so happy that you took the time to join us. At this time, I'd like to introduce Alex Bojan, our Secretary of the Crime Stoppers Gulf Wellington Board of Directors. Alex, a few words?
Yeah, sure. So first, thanks, Sarah, and thank you again for putting together this speaker series. As we continue to live in this virtual world, it's important to have these virtual conversations to keep momentum going and continue the discussion around the impact that this program has because of the support of the community. So on behalf of the board of directors for the program, I'd like to thank Cal for joining us for the inaugural episode of the series. Whether you're a board member like myself or just someone interested in learning more about the program, I have no doubt that we'll all learn something during this episode. So I'm looking forward to it. And again, on behalf of the board, thank you, Cal, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Now, to do a bit of an introduction here, for many people in the Crime Stoppers world, Cal needs no introduction. But for those of us in this area, and you may not be familiar with his name, Cal worked his entire career in Toronto, starting in 1967 with the Toronto Telegram, and then a founding member of the Toronto Sun before moving to the Toronto Star until his retirement in 2005. He has been involved with Crime Stoppers since 1983, first on the steering committee, which set up the Toronto Crime Stoppers program, and then as a board member until 2006 when he moved to Burlington. He then joined Halton Crime Stoppers and spent 13 years with the program until moving to Niagara area and having recently joined Crime Stoppers of Niagara. During his volunteer career with Crime Stoppers, he served on the Ontario Association of Crime Stoppers Board of Directors and was a director on Crime Stoppers International. Most recently, he has written 2 books on Crime Stoppers, including one co-authored with the founder of Crime Stoppers, Greg McAleese, which shares how Crime Stoppers began and how it now operates in countries around the world. Cal and his wife are celebrating 50 years of marriage this year and have a son, a daughter, and 3 grandchildren. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Cal.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, what I'd like to do, and I'm just going to be the voice in the background here, I'm completely okay with that. Why don't we jump right in and have you tell us about how you came to know Detective McAleese and that first crime in Albuquerque, New Mexico?
Well, actually, I met Greg by the telephone first. The Toronto Star assigned me to do an article on Crime Stoppers. It was a new concept in Hamilton at that time in 1983. Calgary was the first city in 1982 in Canada to start the program. Hamilton was the first in Ontario. So when it came to Ontario in Hamilton, I was assigned to write a story on this new concept in policing. I obviously called Greg and I went over to Hamilton to see how the program was, how it worked, because I had no concept of what it was. Greg was very receptive. The people in Hamilton were very receptive. And it really wasn't until probably almost 2 years later, in 1985, that I met Greg. He was at a conference in just outside Chicago, a place called Napierville. And that was really where I got my first introduction to the international aspects of Crime Stoppers, talking to people involved in the program from across the United States and a couple from Canada that had come to join the conference at that time. It was sort of an amazing meeting because Crime Stoppers was such an unusual animal. It incorporated the police and the media, which were 2 organizations that really didn't, they were not compatible as in a friendship, but definitely they worked together. And Greg showed how they actually had worked together through the years because we needed each other. The third aspect was the community. And again, they were part of the solution in solving crime. And that 3-way partnership is really what put Crime Stoppers together. The reason Greg had incorporated the media is because he had graduated in journalism in Albuquerque before he joined the police department, and had worked as a reporter. So he knew the ins and outs of the media world in that sense. It's also interesting to know that although Greg has spent most of his life in the United States working as a police officer and with Crime Stoppers, he was born in Picton, Ontario. As a young boy, his father was with the Canadian Air Force and moved to Albuquerque as a liaison officer with the Canadian Air Force during the nuclear age when we were under a threat from the Russians, and Canada and the United States joined forces in a self-defense pattern. So he literally lived and went to school in the United States, and although definitely 100% is a Canadian. Now that was sort of the introduction I had to Greg, and the time frame is completely off because we have to go back now to July 24, 1976. So not 1983, but 1976. And on that day, in the early morning hours, a boy by the name of Michael Carmen, I'm calling him a boy, he was 20 years old. He was preparing to go into university, had graduated from high school, and his aim was to be a police officer. He was also getting married, but he was working that night at a gas bar in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque at the time was probably one of the most crime-ridden cities in the United States. It had a terrible record, and criminal activity was rampant. Prior to this, Greg had spent 3 years on the police force and was wondering what could be done to make the community safer. Was there something that they were missing? And he was racking his brain, he was thinking outside the box, and he had all sorts of concepts and ideas running through his mind. And he had the model for Crime Stoppers. He didn't have the case where it would work. And sadly, on that night of July 24, 1976, the early morning hours, Michael Carmen was robbed by two gentlemen. One came into the kiosk at the gas bar where he was working, carrying a shotgun. The other suspect waited outside in the car. He handed over a small amount of cash to this bandit. He then stepped back and he thought the robbery was over. The bandit at that point got the indication or impression that Michael recognized him. And he actually confronted him and said, "Do you know who I am? Like, do you know me?" And Michael put his hands up. He said, "No, no." And at that point, the bandit lowered the shotgun and fired at point blank range, very seriously wounding Michael. It was a mortal wound, but he lived for several hours. The bandit stepped over Michael, who'd collapsed to the floor, gathered a few cigarettes from the shelf behind the pay station, and left. Jumped into the car, and they sped away. That was the last anyone heard of those two bandits for some time. Greg McAleese, although he was only 3 years on the force, had quite a meteoric rise. And at that point, he was an acting detective working in the major crime unit. And that was an ancillary unit that assisted the homicide squad. So he was called out to that homicide. And that's basically answering your question if you want to move forward.
No, that's great. And I appreciate that. And for those of us who are in Crime Stoppers, we kind of know the nuts and bolts of it about the robbery and the experience at the gas station and the fact that he was a young man. It's one of those cases, though, that I think we get so caught up in what happened. Don't talk about Michael. And before we get too far into it, let's actually have a conversation a little bit about Michael Carmen, and the fact that we don't hear about him anymore, and maybe why he's dropped out of the narrative when it comes to the Crime Stoppers conversation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought his name up, because as far as I'm concerned, he is the catalyst that actually drove Crime Stoppers, and he is the individual who basically gave his life to have that program started. Obviously knew nothing about it. Greg didn't know anything about it when he arrived at the scene, but Michael is somebody who is forgotten in history. But it was his crime, his life, that started Crime Stoppers. Now, when Greg went to the scene, he assigned police officers to do certain things, such as going door to door. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning before Michael was found by a customer who came in. He was very close to death. He had a very savage, severe wound. It was a callous homicide, and it was terrible. He was taken to, I believe, Presbyterian Hospital, which was about 2 or 3 miles away. Greg made his way to the hospital and found Michael undergoing emergency surgery in the emergency ward. The doctors were fiercely fighting to save his life. Greg hoped that Michael might be able to give him a little bit of information, but sadly he was too severely wounded to communicate. He tried very hard to tell the investigator what he knew, but unfortunately couldn't even form the words and mumbled more than anything. And a couple of hours later, he passed away. Now, he was such an unusual boy. Very quiet. He had an ambition. Even working at the gas bar that night, he was filling in for a shift to allow another employee the time off because he had something else to do. Michael was just a really good cooperative kid who would do anything for you. He had told his mom actually that he wouldn't take any risks at that gas bar because she knew how dangerous it was. She knew the area that the gas bar was located on, Wyoming Avenue. It's a hot spot, a lot of criminal activity. Strangely enough, even at 2 o'clock in the morning or after midnight, there would be a lot of traffic because it was down the road from one of the large military bases, and there are several military bases in Albuquerque. So it was basically the main road leading to one of the gates of one of the facilities. He had hoped to be a police officer, as I said. He also had hoped to be a state police officer. His dad had a military background, and his mom was also hardworking. He had 2 brothers and a sister, or maybe, sorry, 2 sisters and a brother. Now, sadly, the entire family moved away from Albuquerque shortly after the homicide. They went to a community called Sunshine, New Mexico, and not much heard of them. But sadly, when the homicide occurred, it was really just a 3 or 4 paragraph mention in the newspaper. And the reason being, even though it was a homicide and we would consider such a tragedy in our country and such a major incident, it was run of the mill in Albuquerque because that city was so crime ridden. Police officers spent as much time as they could investigating homicides, but sadly there were so many at that time that they had to move on to the next one.
And that's a good point. I'm sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment,
sure.
Cal. One of the things that we've talked about before is the fact that Detective McAleese took a bold step with Michael's family, and he made a promise to his mother that he was going to solve this crime. Now, I know a number of police officers who would say that's a risky thing to do unless you've got a fairly solid, case and evidence building. And in this situation, he didn't have that. So
No, exactly.
how did the family feel once the case was solved, but it was really, it actually became more about the way the crime was solved than it was the crime itself and the victim?
Yeah. Well, when he left Michael at the hospital, when they declared him dead, he went over to Michael's home. His dad was actually working out of town at the time, and his mom was there with two of the sisters. Um, Michael was the youngest in the family, and when Greg actually met the police chaplain, Albuquerque had a chaplain with the police department, as many departments do today, but in that time it was rather rare. And he met the police chaplain, and the two of them went to the home to break this news to the mom, to the parents. They expected everyone would be home, but it was just just his mom, and it was crushing news to her. I mean, it was traumatic. It was a terrible situation, and basically she's alone with a couple of daughters. And in the conversation, and they talked to her for a long, long time, Greg promised her that he would solve the killing. It was an empty promise because at that stage they had nothing. But in his mind, he was convinced that he could do this. And being a police officer for 3 years with limited experience, he was convinced as well that he could do it, and he made that promise. And it's something that police officers don't do, because if you can't solve it, they still want you to have the confidence that someday they will, and they work with the families in a lot of cases. But he did that, and it's something he really shouldn't have done, and he knows he shouldn't have done it. It bothers him today that he did, but he still made it, and it also became a little bit of a drive for him because he wanted to fulfill that promise. So it was a case that was going to nag him for some time. Now
Absolutely.
going back to Crime Stoppers, go ahead, sir.
No, I was just going to say absolutely. And I know, having met Greg McAleese, he now lives in the Philippines, retired from policing a number of years back. But the ones, to transition it back to Crime Stoppers, one of the lighthearted moments from my opportunity to speak with him was when he mentioned that it actually took him longer to come up with the name for Crime Stoppers than the actual concept. That he had the exactly what you said. He had the concept in mind. He knew what it could do. He had the whole vision laid out of like you said, the right case, the right opportunity to use it, but just couldn't think of a name for this program. And I always thought that was interesting because, he says it was 15 minutes to come up with a concept and it seemed like forever to come up with the name. And that just shows you the way the mind works. But yeah, a very fascinating concept, and the story that leads that came out of it, I feel so important for people to know, because when we talk about Crime Stoppers so much anymore, we just talk about, the tip line or the websites or the fundraising. But I really feel it's important to drive home the fact that there's a person who died and there's a case that was solved, and it all is humanized by telling that story about Michael Carmen. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And I wanted to kind of transition then, like I say, back into the Crime Stoppers evolution. And we know that you were investigating it to find out for an application here in Canada. Why do you feel like in the States it seemed to take off fairly promptly, but it wasn't until the 80s that it was moving up into Canada? Why do you feel that it was something that adapted so well in other communities?
Um, in the United States, there's police departments are much closer together, and they want to try things that are successful. This was out of the realm. This was such a different program. I'm surprised it actually caught on as well with the police. Even even getting it started in Albuquerque was um, a huge um, concern for Greg. There was so much that he had to do to convince the authorities within the department. But once he proved the success of the program, other departments were anxious to see if it would help them. There's also with the chiefs of police in the United States, they meet regularly in zones, and they're talking about different dynamics that work. And Crime Stoppers sort of became the flavor of the month very quickly in the U.S. Now I say that in one sense, but actually from Albuquerque, number 2 program was in Orlando. The second one to start was actually in Orlando. The next group started in New Mexico, but there was a quick shift, and it was a very strange connection because somebody who was visiting Albuquerque and heard about Crime Stoppers, just reading it in the newspaper after this case, went back and talked to the police chief in Orlando, and he flew somebody out to see Greg, and they got a program moving very quickly. So that was a strange connection because right after that it started bouncing through New Mexico and then into Texas and spreading around Arizona in that area before it spread across the United States. And there were almost 300 cases before it reached Canada. And again, several years from 1976 to 82. So it took a time span. But basically, the departments were looking for successful programs, and we were doing the same. There were hurdles to jump over, and the biggest hurdle was having somebody who had direct evidence for the investigator, but the investigator couldn't have him as a witness because he promised anonymity. And one of the key elements that Greg came up with right off the bat was the caller, the tipster, would not have to identify themselves in any fashion. And if he was called into court, he wouldn't tell the courts who they were. So his colleagues in the department were not happy with that concept because he has a witness who can directly tie the suspect that they pointed to the case. But the investigators now have to spend lengthy investigative time, and it's not hours, it becomes weeks and sometimes months to build a case because they don't have that witness. So a guarantee of anonymity was something which actually interfered with the growth of the program initially. And Canada had to get over the idea of actually being able to discard a perfectly good witness. But when you look at the ability of investigators, they have that nose that allows them to go out and develop the evidence, build the evidence, and they've got the direction to move. It's like a wheel. So now they're not looking all over the place. They've got a spoke. They can follow that trail that points directly to the person they want to arrest. So they've got a pathway to follow. And by doing that, it takes so much burden away from them because they can spend time focusing on who it is. And the tipster who is providing the information to Crime Stoppers has already provided a great deal of information that has allowed them to go down that path. And they can, I mean, if the person was giving false information, they would quickly discover that because the case would fall apart. But in 99% of the cases in Crime Stoppers, the caller, because of anonymity and because of a reward, which are the two elements that Greg offered, the information they're providing is of a tremendous benefit to police and the investigator to follow that trail and come up with an arrest. So that was the hurdle that Canadian authorities had to get over. Also, the police in the United States had to do the same thing, but because of the success that we're having, and once Crime Stoppers started, it was like a snowball effect, and they saw how positive the program was and how beneficial, not only to the community but to the investigators themselves, because they were solving more and more cases.
That's terrific. That you actually just took care of my next question, which was when it transitioned to Canada, what challenges were presented. But I think it's very interesting, and you've illustrated it so well. It's all about the dynamic with Crime Stoppers not actually being a police entity, and people struggle with that in the public. And then of course the police, having to figure a new relationship with an organization that works within their realm of reducing and resolving crime, but yet not having the same authority over that organization. It's such a unique structure to this organization, right? And on top of that, to introduce the media, right? And we didn't really talk about that with Michael's case, but the media is so crucial. And I know certainly here in Guelph Wellington, we're always talking about our media partners and how important it is to have that engagement in the community, to put the information out about cases that need to be solved, and to keep awareness about the program, keep it front of mind for the public. So I'm glad you touched on that. But as far as when it comes into Canada then, when you saw, you were doing investigating yourself to see what the suitability would be for your area, what was the reception once you came back and had spoken to Greg and had learned a little more about the program yourself?
Well, it was interesting because I had the information about Crime Stoppers. I hadn't written the story yet, and I called the police chief in Toronto, and I gave him a brief overview of what the concept was, and I asked him, would it be something that they would start in Toronto? And he said, we are looking into it. It was a wonderful answer because I'm sure I was the first person to tell him about it. But it gave us a lead that Toronto police were looking into a program that blah, blah, blah. So it allowed us to have that sort of news peg locally, as well as report on what had happened in Calgary, in Hamilton, and down in Albuquerque, as well as elsewhere. So it opened the door. It opened the door to Toronto developing a program themselves. It was interesting because I spoke to another inspector of a department adjacent to Toronto, and their answer was no way. I also spoke to inspectors in Toronto who would said that won't work here. It was interesting because you really have to look beyond your normal scope to think in the way that how Crime Stoppers could assist you, because it's a completely different program. And when the chief said, we're looking into it, his eyes, he was receptive. You could tell that. Now, it was quite interesting because that actually became the invitation that I received to join Crime Stoppers. And it was several months later, the chief called and he said, you seem to know more about this program than anybody else. Would you be interested in joining a steering committee to see how we can implement it in Toronto? And of course, I jumped at the opportunity because I had seen the benefit of Crime Stoppers all over North America at that point. And it was such a innovative program that I thought it was something that needed to be developed in Toronto. So I wanted to be part of that. And when I joined the steering committee, I was shocked at the caliber of individuals that had been selected. There was an inspector who later became a superintendent, staff superintendent, Clark Winter, and he was given the task of bringing the steering committee together. And he absolutely did an amazing job of finding people who were movers and shakers, but also people who could think outside the box and not the individuals who people go to when they want to put a project together and they write the checks. These were the workers. He had put together a group of people that could actually bring Crime Stoppers to fruition. And it was interesting. I was a media person, so nowhere near their caliber. These were such tremendous individuals in so many aspects of the community. One was the manager of a shopping plaza, not just a shopping plaza, the Eaton Center. Another one was the owner, the manager of a very large insurance company. There were a fellow that ran the Becker's organization. Now, he could have also written a check, but he was the type of person who, roll up the sleeves and get going. That caliber of individual were brought together. We had about 16 people on that steering committee, and we added a few, and some dropped off. And there were 3 media people. I was one of them, representing newspapers. It was a fellow from CKY and another person from City TV. And it was interesting to see how it evolved, because once people understood what it was, the ideas started to flow. And they mapped out an organization for Toronto within 2 meetings. And we had the concept. Not only did we have the concept, we had the pathway for money to come in. We were not in a position to take donations, but we already had donations on the table, so that when we were ready to go, the checks would be written and put in the bank account. What we weren't aware of, or we didn't expect, was the delays that we had trying to get a charter, trying to get a charitable license, trying to get the framework, the legal framework put together for an organization. These guys knew how to run companies. You go down to City Hall, you register it with the province, and these things happen instantly. But starting a charity is a little different. And then trying to put something together that nobody is aware of is even more impractical. And it was a great experience. It was a tremendous experience, a learning experience for a lot of people. And we drew on what Calgary had done. We drew on what Hamilton had done. And it really worked. And the government, at the end of the day, were very helpful. And they understood. I'm sure that a couple of people didn't think Crime Stoppers would work, but at least they were giving Toronto the chance to put something together that would be practical.
That's such a great example of how important it is to have that volunteer investment, those individuals from the community that are willing to come forward and give back to an organization like this. And I'm totally brown nosing right now because I know I have board members on this call right now from Guelph Wellington, but it is true, because without that community investment in the program, it just wouldn't work. You need to have people that you say could be connected, could be have skills or abilities that are an asset to the program. And that's very important to drive home how essential our volunteers are. And I really thank you for bringing that up. And I want to ask you, you volunteered for a number of years now in a number of different programs. Why do you continue to volunteer with Crime Stoppers?
Well, I believe in the program, but before you leave that, I should have pointed out the Toronto Junior Board of Trade was one of the people where we drew individuals from. Now, the Chamber of Commerce is a huge partner of Crime Stoppers around the world. Chambers, in many cases, actually have started. And when Albuquerque started, it was the Chamber who were influential behind it, encouraging the business community, etc. But I just wanted to mention that. Now, my own involvement, I believe in Crime Stoppers. Crime Stoppers not only solves crime, and it's proven to do that, but it also protects communities and makes places safer. um, when I was involved in the community, we had community meetings, and you'd go out to talk to organization or to groups of citizens in a neighborhood, and you'd say, "What are your crime concerns?" You know, and I probably just come from a murder or a bank robbery or something like that, and they'd say, "Speeding pizza trucks, or or noise, or kids playing in the park." And I'm, like, do they not understand that there's all sorts of things going out there? All of a sudden, I turned around and I said, that is their concern. That's the concern that bothers them the most. And if you solve those problems, it makes their life more comfortable. They're not impacted by murders and robberies and all sorts of things that do go on. That happens somewhere else. But very quickly I found out that safety and security in your neighborhood is what people are looking for. And Crime Stoppers actually does that. It provides that comfort to people that they feel safe. And the two elements in Albuquerque that bothered Greg so much were the fear of the community and the apathy. They were happy in their own little neighborhood, providing nothing happened. And they couldn't care less what was going on elsewhere because they were comfortable. And you had to break through that cycle. And if you've got a program that is Crime Stoppers, and Neighborhood Watch was similar, although Neighborhood Watch wasn't capturing the bad guys, but it was making people feel safer in the communities. And what I discovered very quickly was that element of security was necessary, and Crime Stoppers was a solution. So I was very happy to be involved in that program.
That's excellent. I love that answer. It's just such a great way to be involved. Now, I see our time. I cannot believe how quickly it is going here, but I do want to give you one last question before we open it up to the floor, which is, what do you say to people, because I'm sure you've had this asked of you more than once, what do you, or said to you more than once, what do you say to people who just write it off as a snitch line? Or think that they're not anonymous, that are jaded or maybe don't have the same faith in the program that you have? What do you tell those people?
Well, I mean, you can't convince everyone, but you can convince people that it is anonymous. In Canada, some Crime Stopper programs have been taken to court to get the information that somebody called in on a tip line, because the person arrested maybe wants to know who they were for all sorts of nefarious reasons. But at the end of the day, in Canada, and this is very important, there was a case in Vancouver, in British Columbia, that the lawyer, the defense lawyer, asked the court to turn over the tip. The judge who was hearing the case said, yes, we're going to do that. And I've got this wrong, sorry. He said, no, we can't do that because of Crime Stoppers. They went to the next phase, okay? And the judge said, am I still there?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, sorry,
That's okay.
my screen went blank.
That's okay.
The judge said they don't have to, they have to turn over the tip, and the prosecutor said, if they have to turn over the tip, we will withdraw the charges. And the case was basically dismissed. The defense lawyer, and the case is called Liepert, the defense lawyer said, no, 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 we want the tip. So we're going to go to the Supreme Court of Canada and get it from you. This lawyer has already said we can have it. This judge, rather, justice. So now we're going to go to the Supreme Court and we're going to get the tip. So the Supreme Court turned around and said, you can't have the tip. Not only can't you have the tip, there's so many reasons you can't have the tip, because they don't know who the caller is. There's no way of proving anything, all this and that and the other thing. And at the end of the day, these defendants who were found, that were released from custody because were recharged and convicted because their defense lawyer forced them to go forward, hoping that he would get the tip and destroy Crime Stoppers. What he actually accomplished was the Supreme Court of Canada gave protection to people who call Crime Stoppers and guaranteed their anonymity. So, I mean, it was a reversal of what the defense counsel had hoped for, but a tremendous victory for Crime Stoppers. Now, we've had several other cases and there's different aspects to it, but the Liepert decision remains paramount. There's also another case where somebody had fraudulently called Crime Stoppers to take the trail off himself on a homicide case and move it onto someone else. And the court ruled that the tip had to be disclosed because the individual wasn't a true tipster. He was in fact a guilty party. So it gave another little protection to Crime Stoppers in that we can't protect a guilty party. We can't knowingly protect, we wouldn't knowingly, but if somebody calls us hoping to get out of a charge, it won't work through Crime Stoppers. Only legitimate, anonymous individuals have the right to call Crime Stoppers. And that's a protection which stands up not only in Canada. There are several cases similar to that in the United States, nothing at the Supreme Court level. But when people are looking for cases that they can cite in court in the United States, they can call on a Canadian court if it's higher than the one they have. So that precedent can actually be used in the United States. It can also be used in England, which is a similar law than ours. So not only have we established a case here, but we've given some authority to other areas of the world, which is really beneficial. The United States, I'm amazed that they haven't actually got that legislation. At the state level, there's some very strong legislation and law protecting Crime Stoppers. Some of it is under complete governor authority in the United States. And they've got crime commissions and everything else which protect Crime Stoppers. Very early in Greg's career with the Crime Stoppers program, he was called into court and he fully expected that the judge would force him to hand over the tip. But at the end of the day, when he actually refused, the judge backed down. But he was told by the judge, bring your toothbrush, because if you don't tell me, you're going to jail. And he did stand his ground, and the judge nodded, hummed and hawed, and said, there's nothing I can do. And that was the end of it.
I think of the case, when you mentioned these, Cal, it reminds me of the case, and this is when I first started in Guelph, Wellington. I came upon the video of the coordinator. It was one of the Florida programs where he had been called to disclose the tip. And this is many moons ago when they actually still had paper tips, like things were printed out. And the gentleman was told, you bring it to court, you have it in a folder, we're going to be disclosing it. He ate it in court. He refused to disclose it and he ate the tip. And I always thought, like, that's hardcore. You're going hard on Crime Stoppers to protect that program to eat the tip. That's tremendous.
No,
Thank you so much.
He also went to jail. He went to jail.
Yeah, he did. He did. When you said toothbrush, that's what made me think of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a moment now. Sorry.
But he protected that tip.
Yes, he did.
protected. Yeah,
Yes, that's right. So again, I wanted to just give a moment to the people who are joining us this evening. If anyone has any questions, I mean, I've been able to kind of monopolize the conversation with Cal, but this is a great opportunity for our participants to, you know, ask questions yourselves. If there's anything that you've wanted to know about Crime Stoppers or just want to ask Cal with his experience in writing the books. And we're going to talk about those in just a second, but I would give you the opportunity now. Let us know.
Hi, Cal. It's Avery.
Hi, Avery, how are you?
Great. I am just amazed. I'm so glad I got to tune in here tonight. You're a wealth of information, and I had no idea that the origin of Crime Stoppers. Terrible for me to say that I don't know, but I didn't realize. So this has been incredible and very eye-opening, and just amazing for me to hear this. So I work in the OPP, and one of my programs is to support Crime Stoppers programs. So this is very, very informative. So thank you very much.
Now, the OPP, sorry to interrupt you, the OPP are a tremendous supporter of the organization. And
Well,
Tom O'Grady, a former commissioner,
yes.
equated Crime Stoppers as the three modern top innovations of Crime Stoppers. Three modern. So fingerprinting, DNA, and Crime Stoppers. Three top innovations.
Incredible. I'm going to
Yeah.
agree there. Yes. We're trying to keep it in the forefront. And I think our current commissioner as well, Commissioner Karik, is also a huge proponent and supporter of Crime Stoppers too. So we're doing our best to keep it in the forefront. And I think it is a very highly supported program in the OPP. So that's great.
Yeah, wonderful. And the current commissioner did send a very nice letter to all programs,
Yes.
thanking them for what they do for the OPP and all law enforcement.
Yes, that's exactly. So with all of your knowledge and your history of the program, what are your thoughts about how the program has changed over the years, and also with the new development and how they're doing the Crime Stoppers program in Toronto? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, each community operates their own Crime Stoppers program. There are rules on how it should operate. And when you go away from the rules, you have problems. But the rules are the anonymity and basically protecting that and never ever going away to reveal who called Crime Stoppers. I mean, that's the most important aspect. How each program operates is it's really up to themselves. New York City have an unbelievable Crime Stoppers program, which is well funded and everything else. But at one point, they said, we are unable to pay rewards for drug tips. We'll still take drug tips, but we get so many of them that we'd be broke within a couple of weeks. So they said, we'll no longer pay for rewards on drug tips. And they're very well funded, but that's it. Toronto no longer pays rewards, but they have another process whereby they can promote wanted suspects with a significant reward coming from another organization. And their money that they collect goes into the safety of the community. So that's
I
how
think,
they do it.
yeah, I think it's a very
Go
unique
ahead.
approach. Mhm.
It is a unique approach, and it was something that they needed to do to ensure the success of their program. In Niagara, we want to get back to basics and make the appeals to have the public help us solve crime and offer a reward. That's the way we want it. And so many other communities want to stay on that. But there are other programs that operate differently. In other parts of the world, programs have to operate differently because of laws. In Holland, they're not allowed to pay a reward. We were never allowed to pay a reward here for stolen property. That law was amended and we can now do it. But it was because of Crime Stoppers. And when Crime Stoppers started, programs had to be aware that they cannot pay a reward just to find some stolen property. but things change, and that's really the evolution, and they evolve at whatever the community wants them to evolve at, and how the program is going to be more effective or most effective in your community. And I think that's important.
Thank you very much. And the R versus Liepert case law is also another insightful piece that you have brought forward that we all study. We all in OPP policing would know the Liepert case quite well. But to hear from you directly about it is even more, brings it even more it makes it even more of an interesting approach and an example of why it exists today and how it all came about. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, and I mean that was a case that made Crime Stoppers very nervous, because had it gone the other way, we wouldn't be here today. The program couldn't operate without that protection.
Thanks, Cal.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Avery. That's
other,
great. Oops, sorry, Cal.
Yeah. No, I said there's a lot of other cases, local cases, that, I wish we could catalog them all, because there's been many attempts by suspects or people before the courts to find out who actually is responsible for the tip, and they're protected, and there's good reason, because some people have legitimate fear. I mean, they're directly connected in some manner to that crime, how it occurred. They're on the fringe, but to have the intimate knowledge that some people have, they're very close to those who committed the crimes. So it is dangerous for them to call.
Excellent. Is there anyone else who has a question that they'd like to share? No, looks like we're good. All right, I'm just going to thank you at this point in time, Cal, for sharing your time with us. I knew I was going to learn a lot tonight, and you absolutely did not disappoint. Before we wrap up, why don't you give us, sorry?
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, why don't you give us the names of your books, so that if anyone wants to order them and have a little more in-depth experience, they're able to do that?
Well, the two books. The first one was What is Crime Stoppers? And the second book is Crime Stoppers, The Inside Story. Looking over there to make sure I get the titles right. But they were written basically to let people know what this conversation, what is Crime Stoppers? And they're available at Amazon. But and I interrupted you there. What I wanted to say was there's a really interesting statistic which has stayed with Crime Stoppers for as long as I can remember, and that is that there's a crime solved every 14 minutes as a result of a tip to Crime Stoppers. Somewhere in the world, there's a crime solved every 14 minutes. And we used to have a 98% conviction rate as well. I think it's about 94 now. But one of the reasons that we don't have accurate figures is a lot of programs don't follow through to find out exactly what happened with them. So we're not able to keep the statistics that I would like. But for at least 30 years, they were keeping very, very solid statistics on Crime Stoppers. And when you looked at the numbers of property recovered, the amount of drugs that were seized, they were astronomical. And we thought it was amazing when we talked in the millions. Then you're talking in the triple figure billions. This is crazy, It is absolutely an amazing program that solves so much crime, and it's simple. It's just a simple concept, and it's as simple as Robert Peel. You go back to his principles, and he said, get the community to help. You can't do it alone. And be honest and get help. Admit that you need assistance and such what. That's fine. And then Greg, when he was looking to see the name Crime Stoppers behind you, he says, I should have just asked Chester Gould. Dick Tracy. He used to have Dick Tracy's Crime Stoppers tips. And that actually became a little bit of a problem when he came up with the idea of Crime Stoppers, because the newspaper started using it as their flag line. And Chester Gould's people said, wait a minute, that's copyright with us. And Chester Gould actually gave the permission for Crime Stoppers to use that name without charge, without anything. And he was proud of it. And when I said I went to Napierville to that first conference, that's near his hometown. And he was to be a guest speaker there, but sadly passed away just before the conference. But he did have some, his family was there, and he donated some of the Crime Stoppers tips to the Crime Stoppers International. So just a little aside.
Well, I'm gonna take a jump off point from your comment about statistics. We haven't announced it yet, but before the end of the month, we're going to be releasing our statistics for 2020. And I'm going to tell you all as an exclusive here that Crime Stoppers Guelph Wellington in 2020, for all the craziness that happened last year, we actually recovered over $71,000 in drugs, personal property, and cash. And we're considered a small program of under 300,000 population. So that just drives home the point you were making, Cal, that it does work, it is effective, and it's making such a difference in our community. So I thank you very much for bringing that up. And before we wrap up, I wanted to also, if you want to give a shout out, you're active on social media. Do you want to maybe share what platforms you're on if people want to follow you?
Yeah, on Twitter and Facebook.
Okay, and just Cal
So
Millar,
just
Millar
the
with
name
an A.
up there. Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone who joined us tonight for our first session of the Crime Stoppers Guelph Wellington series featuring Cal Millar. I hope you found the session as informative as I did, and be sure to follow Cal, order his books, or deep dive more on your own time into the Crime Stoppers story. Thank you so much, Cal.